The soft yellow glow of the overhead light spilled onto the polished wooden surface of the dining table, casting gentle, wavering shadows. Vivian sat in silence, gripping a glass of red wine tightly in her hand, her eyes fixed on an undefined spot in the distance. The house, already quiet by nature, now seemed oppressively so, the kind of silence that pressed down on her chest like a weight. The rhythmic ticking of the clock echoed faintly, each second stretching endlessly, as if to remind her of the solitude she had come to know too well. Ethan had returned home that afternoon after nearly 6 months away. His presence brought a newfound energy to the house, yet it also stirred emotions within Vivian that she couldn't quite name. When she saw him for the first time in months, her heart fluttered uncomfortably. Ethan was no longer the boy who once hid behind her legs in shyness. He was taller now, his frame more solid, his gaze brimming with a confidence that was both familiar and disarming. When their eyes briefly met, Vivian felt an unsettling pang in her chest. The sensation scared her. Footsteps sounded faintly from the hallway, breaking the stillness and pulling her back into the present. The kitchen door creaked slightly as it swung open, and Ethan stepped inside, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. He stopped in his tracks when he saw her sitting alone, shrouded in the dim glow of the light. "Couldn't sleep, Mum?" Ethan's voice was low, gentle, yet filled with concern. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, setting the mug down on the table. His eyes locked onto hers, as though he were trying to unravel the tangled thoughts running through her mind. Vivian startled slightly, recovering quickly as she forced herself to appear composed. "I just needed some quiet," she murmured, her voice trembling faintly as she avoided his gaze, turning the glass of wine slowly in her hands. "You don't seem okay," Ethan observed, his tone warm yet steady. His eyes never left her, and there was an insistence in his voice that left her feeling exposed. "What's wrong?" Vivian forced a small, hollow smile to her lips, a weak attempt to deflect the question. "Nothing, Ethan. Just work. That's all." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical, the weight of his gaze pressing against her. "You always say that, but it never feels like it's just work." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "Is it because of me?" The unexpected question made her chest tighten. Her gaze snapped up to meet his, wide and uncertain. "Why would you ask that?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, as though carefully considering his response. "I don't know," he admitted at last. "It's just, you've seemed different since I came home." Vivian fell silent. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't even sure she understood the emotions that had begun stirring within her. All she knew was that Ethan's presence had altered the atmosphere around her. His proximity made her feel conflicted. Part of her wanted to retreat, but another part wanted to draw closer. The tension between them thickened, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Ethan lowered his gaze to the table, his hand brushing against her wineglass in what seemed to be a casual gesture. But when he looked back up at her, there was something unreadable in his eyes, something that made her pulse quicken. "I took a picture of you today," Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost tentative. "At the gallery. You didn't notice." Vivian blinked, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Why would you do that?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice growing quieter, as if he were confessing something he wasn't sure he should. "But when I looked through the lens, I saw someone I hadn't really seen before. Someone beautiful. Someone lonely. And I don't think you even realized it." Vivian's breath caught in her throat. His words were like a blade slicing through the fragile composure she had so carefully constructed. "Ethan," she began, but her voice faltered, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," Ethan said softly, but his gaze didn't waver. I want you to know that you don't have to feel that way. You don't have to be alone. I'm here." The simplicity of his words struck her harder than she expected. They were heavy with meaning, with an undercurrent of something unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Vivian couldn't find the right words to respond. Her hands trembled slightly as she tightened her grip on the wineglass, her eyes falling to the floor as a wave of unease swept over her. In that moment, Vivian knew something had shifted. The boundary between them, the one she thought was unshakable, had begun to blur. She felt the tension coil tightly within her, a silent warning of what lay ahead. Could she summon the strength to stop what was already in motion? Or would she let herself be swept away, unable to resist the pull of emotions she knew she shouldn't entertain? The wind outside howled softly, rattling the windows as though echoing the turmoil in her heart. Somewhere in the stillness of the house, something fragile had begun to crack. Vivian sat quietly in her small study, the warm glow of the desk lamp casting soft shadows over the scattered papers before her. She wasn't working, though. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her gaze distant, fixed on the partially open window. The darkness outside mirrored the loneliness that had taken root deep within her, a familiar ache that had accompanied her for so many years. In her younger days, Vivian had dreamed of a happy, fulfilling life with the man she loved. She had met Thomas, her ex-husband, at a summer party when she was just 25. Thomas had an undeniable charm, his confident demeanour and radiant smile sweeping her off her feet. Their love was passionate, intense, and she was certain he was the one she would spend the rest of her life with. But such fervent love rarely endured the tests of time. Just a few years into their marriage, everything began to change. Thomas grew distant, prioritising his career over his family. He was often away on long business trips or claimed late meetings that stretched deep into the night. Vivian began to suspect something was wrong, and her worst fears were confirmed when she discovered sweet, intimate messages he had exchanged with another woman. Her heart shattered as she read them, but rather than confront him, she chose silence. She couldn't bear the thought of breaking their family apart, not while Ethan, their 12-year-old son at the time, was still so young and innocent. From that point on, Vivian's life revolved solely around Ethan. She poured all her energy into raising him, believing that her unconditional love could fill the void left by his absent father. Yet deep down, she knew she had changed. The vibrant, hopeful woman she once was had faded away. In her place stood a devoted, resilient mother, but one who buried her pain behind a composed and gentle facade. As Ethan grew older, he became her greatest pride, but he also became a poignant reminder of everything she had lost. Every time she looked into Ethan's eyes, eyes that bore an uncanny resemblance to Thomas's, she was forced to relive the fragments of happiness that had slipped through her fingers and the many nights she had spent alone, carrying the weight of their family on her shoulders. Ethan never suspected the depth of her sorrow. To him, she was a pillar of strength, unshakable and enduring. And Vivian, with all her willpower, never allowed him to see the cracks beneath her surface. Then one day, Mark stepped back into her life, a small but steady light in the darkness. Mark had been her friend since college, a polished, warm-hearted man who seemed to carry an endless supply of humour and wisdom. He had once harboured feelings for Vivian, but by the time he found the courage to confess them, she was already engaged to Thomas. Years later, when he learned of her divorce, he began visiting often, bringing with him his easy laughter and thoughtful advice. Their relationship, however, remained firmly rooted in friendship, as Vivian was unwilling to let anyone close enough to touch her heart again. Mark understood her better than anyone else, which was precisely why he often sensed the subtle shifts in her life that others might overlook. When Ethan returned home for summer break, Mark noticed the way Vivian looked at her son, how her gaze lingered just a moment too long. It wasn't the look of a mother, but something deeper, more complicated, something he couldn't quite name. He didn't press her about it, but his silence became a mirror reflecting her own unease. One evening, while Ethan and Vivian were sitting together in the living room, Mark arrived unannounced. He brought a bottle of wine, as he often did, and joined them for conversation. But the atmosphere in the room was different that night. Something felt off, and Mark couldn't ignore it.
He noticed the subtle tension between Vivian and Ethan, the unspoken words hanging in the air. He saw the way Ethan looked at Vivian, his gaze brimming with a kind of care and intensity that didn't seem entirely appropriate. And he saw how Vivian deliberately avoided meeting Ethan's eyes, her discomfort palpable.
After Ethan went to bed, Mark lingered in the kitchen with Vivian. "What's going on, Vivian?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The question caught her off guard. She forced a laugh, shaking her head in an attempt to dispel the unease. "Nothing, Mark. It's just life. Work. The usual." But Mark wasn't so easily convinced. "I've known you too long not to notice when something's bothering you. It's about Ethan, isn't it? He's grown, and I've seen the way he looks at you. Is there something you're not telling me?" His words cut through her like a blade. Vivian wanted to tell him everything, to unburden herself of the weight she had been carrying. But fear held her back, fear of what would happen if she admitted the truth. Instead, she turned away, gripping the edge of the kitchen sink to steady herself. "Please, Mark, don't push this. I can't." Mark didn't press further. He stood there for a moment, then placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before quietly leaving. But the look in his eyes as he walked out the door was filled with concern and suspicion. Vivian knew in that moment that she couldn't keep hiding from what was happening. Outside, the night wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the rustling of leaves, an ominous whisper of warning. Inside, Vivian stood frozen, her heart pounding as she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back at her was no longer the strong, independent person she thought she was. She was someone caught in a storm of emotions she could no longer control. The house was steeped in a heavy silence that evening, an oppressive stillness settling over it after a long day. Vivian sat on the living room sofa, the dim light from a single table lamp casting soft shadows across her face. Her expression was tense, as though weighed down by invisible burdens. She wondered if the strange emotions swirling within her were something any mother might feel, or if it was just her, trapped in the chaos of her own mind. On the table before her, a half-empty glass of red wine shimmered faintly, reflecting the unease in her eyes. Ethan stepped into the room, carrying with him an air of quiet intensity. He wore a plain white t-shirt, his hair slightly damp from the shower, and the faint scent of soap mixed with the warmth radiating from his youthful, robust frame. Vivian didn't look up immediately, but she felt his presence the moment he entered. Ethan's gaze was fixed on her, unyielding, as though he were waiting for something. "You're still up?" His voice was low and steady, breaking the silence. Ethan moved closer, setting a glass of water on the table before sinking into the chair opposite her. "Is something wrong?" Vivian lifted her eyes, meeting his. It was a gaze she had known since he was a child, yet it carried something unfamiliar now, something deeper, more complex, and dangerous. She quickly looked away, trying to mask the growing unease within her. "Nothing's wrong, Ethan. I just couldn't sleep," she said, her tone deliberately casual. Ethan didn't respond right away. He studied her, his silence heavy with unspoken thoughts, then leaned forward, his posture suddenly resolute. "Mum, I need to talk to you. Seriously." Vivian set her wineglass down, her hands tightening in her lap. She could feel her heartbeat quickening but maintained her composure. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze unwavering but tinged with hesitation. "Do you ever feel lonely?" The question landed like a sharp jolt. Vivian froze, caught off guard. She had no idea how to respond. The question pierced through the layers of defense she had built over the years. "Why would you ask that?" she managed, her voice strained despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Because you don't seem happy," Ethan replied, his tone soft yet firm. "You always tell me you're fine, but I don't believe you. I see it in your eyes, in the way you avoid my questions. You don't have to hide it from me." Vivian opened her mouth to deny it, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned away, her eyes closing as if to hold back the tears threatening to spill. She didn't want Ethan to see her vulnerable, but she also couldn't bring herself to lie. "I've grown used to it, Ethan. Loneliness isn't new to me." "But you don't have to bear it alone," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have me. I'm here for you." Vivian turned back to him, her eyes locking with his, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ethan reached out and gently took her hand in his, the warmth of his touch spreading through her like a wave. "You're not just my mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're the most important person in my life." His words hit her like a tidal wave, crashing through every barrier she had built. She pulled her hand away, feeling as though she were walking a razor-thin line between right and wrong. "Ethan, you don't know what you're saying. This can't happen." "Then why don't you leave?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice rising with a new intensity. "If it's wrong, why don't you stand up and walk away?" Vivian stood, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She couldn't answer. It was as if her feet were anchored by an invisible force holding her in place. Ethan stood as well, closing the distance between them. "You can't keep denying this, Vivian. I know you feel it too." The space between them disappeared, and Ethan stood close enough that she could feel his breath. Vivian wanted to step back, to redraw the line that had been blurred, but her body wouldn't listen. When Ethan reached out and gently touched her face, her eyes closed, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Ethan, we shouldn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't say anything," Ethan murmured, his gaze locked on hers. And then, as if the world around them ceased to exist, he leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. It wasn't just a gesture of comfort, it was an unspoken acknowledgement of all the emotions they had been trying to suppress. Vivian couldn't stop herself. She knew that this moment would change everything, that it was a step they couldn't take back. But in that instant, all the worry, all the moral boundaries seemed to dissolve. All she could feel was the warmth of Ethan, the closeness she had craved but never dared to admit. That night, the house was quieter than it had ever been, but within the shadows, something irrevocable had shifted. They had crossed a line they both knew was forbidden but couldn't resist. And as the first light of morning filtered through the windows, Vivian sat on the sofa, staring at her untouched cup of coffee. The events of the night replayed in her mind like a storm, tearing through every shred of reason. The conflict between what had happened and what should have never been left her restless, exhausted. Ethan's footsteps echoed on the stairs, slow and deliberate. He appeared in the doorway, his expression pensive. His plain white t-shirt clung to his frame, and his gaze sought hers as though searching for answers. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady yet resolute. Vivian looked up, her eyes betraying the turmoil inside her. She didn't reply, and Ethan moved closer, sitting down across from her. In his presence, the weight of unspoken words pressed down on both of them, the air between them charged with the inevitability of what lay ahead. "Do you regret what happened?" Ethan's question hit Vivian like a blow, stopping her breath. Her eyes met his, searching for an answer she didn't have. The emotions swirling inside her were too conflicting: fear, guilt, and an inexplicable longing all tangled together in an impossible knot. "Don't ask me that, Ethan," she replied, her voice trembling as she averted her gaze. "What happened? It shouldn't have happened." Ethan didn't look away. His eyes carried a storm of emotions, pain, confusion, and something that looked like defiance. "If it shouldn't have happened, why didn't we stop? Why didn't you walk away right then and there?" Vivian lowered her head, her hands twisting together as if searching for something solid to hold on to. She didn't know how to answer, couldn't find the words to explain the unexplainable. Before she could speak, the front door creaked open, and Mark stepped inside, carrying a bag of coffee. His eyes swept over the room, immediately catching the tension between the two of them. His brow furrowed in suspicion as he placed the bag on the table. What's going on here? Mark's tone was calm but probing, his gaze shifting between Vivian and Ethan. Vivian stood abruptly, her face a mask of barely concealed panic. Nothing, Mark. We were just talking. Mark's eyes narrowed as he shifted his focus to Ethan. Talking? The kind of talking that leaves the air feeling like this. His voice was edged with doubt. Ethan stood as well, meeting Mark's gaze head on. You don't need to interfere, Mark. This is a family matter. Mark raised an eyebrow, his suspicion deepening. A family matter? Vivian, I've known you for years. Don't try to tell me I'm imagining this. What's going on? Vivian fought to maintain her composure, but her voice betrayed her. There's nothing, Mark. Please, just let it go. Mark took a step back, his expression shifting to one of disappointment and concern. Vivian, you're hiding something. I can see it in your face. I just want to help. Before Vivian could respond, Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between her and Mark. You don't understand, Mark. This isn't something you can be part of. The tension between them crackled like electricity, and for a moment it seemed as though neither man would back down. But finally, Mark exhaled deeply, his voice dropping to a low, disappointed tone. If you can't trust me, Vivian, then I don't know what else to say. He turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that left the room unbearably quiet. Vivian sank into the chair, her head falling into her hands. We've gone too far, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Everything is wrong. Ethan knelt before her, his hands gently resting on hers. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I just know I want to be here, with you, and I'm not going anywhere. Tears rolled down Vivian's cheeks as she looked into Ethan's determined eyes. She knew, deep down, that everything was spiraling out of control, that they were heading down a road with no return. But in that moment, under the weight of his gaze, she couldn't let go. She couldn't walk away, even though she knew she should. Later that night, the house was cloaked in a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Vivian sat in her study, her eyes fixed on the black and white photograph on her desk, a portrait Ethan had taken of her weeks earlier. In the photo, she stood by the gallery window, the natural light filtering through the curtains to highlight her face with a soft, wistful glow. Ethan had said he wanted to capture that moment, but now, looking at it, all Vivian could feel was an overwhelming sense of conflict and guilt. She stood and wandered down the hallway, the stillness of the house amplifying every footstep. She didn't know where she was going or what she intended to do. Her mind felt heavy, weighed down by the unrelenting battle between reason and emotion. Since the day Mark had walked out, the air between her and Ethan had shifted. There were no more lingering conversations, no more glances exchanged in silence. They were avoiding each other, both afraid of confronting the reality of what they had done. The door to Ethan's room was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm light spilling into the hallway. Vivian hesitated before peering in. Ethan sat at his desk, leaning back in his chair, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting soft shadows across his face. He held his old camera in his hands, staring at the screen with a furrowed brow. His expression was tense, as though he was lost in a maze of his own thoughts. Taking a deep breath, Vivian stepped into the room. Ethan glanced up, startled for a moment, but quickly composed himself, his face settling into a calm mask that couldn't quite hide the pain beneath. "Do you need something, Mum?" he asked, his voice low, almost detached. Vivian didn't respond immediately. She moved closer, sitting on the edge of his bed, facing him. "Ethan, we can't keep doing this. We need to talk." Ethan set the camera down, swiveling in his chair to face her fully. "What do you want to say?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "That it was a mistake? That we should go back to pretending nothing ever happened?" Vivian lowered her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know. I just know that we can't continue like this. Not for me, and not for you. You have your whole life ahead of you, Ethan. I don't want to be the reason you lose your way." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and sadness. "You think I don't know what I'm doing? You think I haven't thought about this every second since it happened? You're the only person in my life who's ever made me feel truly loved. Do you think I can just walk away from that?" His words pierced through her, leaving her speechless. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, the depth of his emotions, and it tore her apart. Vivian reached out, her hand trembling as it rested on his. "I love you, Ethan. But this isn't the way. We have to find a way to move forward, even if it means letting go." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening, but his resolve remained unbroken. "I can't let go, Mom. I won't." Ethan's words cut into Vivian's heart like sharp blades. She could feel the truth in every word he said, and it only deepened the ache inside her. "Ethan, I love you too. But not like this. It can't be like this." Ethan rose from his seat and walked over to the window. He gazed outside, the faint glow of the streetlights casting soft shadows across his face, making him look both resolute and heartbreakingly lonely. "You're right," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if it might vanish into the stillness of the room. "We can't go on like this. But I don't know how to forget you. I don't know how to see you as just my mother." Vivian felt tears stream down her cheeks. She wanted to comfort him, to say something that could ease the pain etched into his words. But every thought she tried to form felt feeble, inadequate. Rising to her feet, she approached him, her hand trembling as she placed it gently on his shoulder. "We'll get through this, Ethan. I promise. I'll never leave you to face this alone." He turned to look at her, his eyes glistening with raw emotion. For a moment, it seemed as if he was about to speak, but before the words could leave his lips, the doorbell rang, shattering the fragile silence. Vivian startled, pulling her hand away as she hurried down the stairs to answer it. When she opened the door, she found Mark standing there, his expression a blend of cold certainty and deep concern, as though he already knew what she was trying so desperately to hide. "We need to talk, Vivian," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. Vivian didn't speak, simply stepped aside to let him in. As he entered the house, Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his footsteps deliberate as he descended. For a brief, charged moment, his eyes met Mark's, the tension between them nearly tangible. Mark turned back to Vivian, his voice sharpening as he addressed her. "You think I don't see it? You think you can hide this forever? Vivian, I've known you long enough to recognize when something's wrong. And I know you're keeping something from me." Vivian stood frozen, her lips parted but unable to form a response. Her wide eyes mirrored the fear and uncertainty she felt, but no words came. Mark's gaze shifted to Ethan, his tone cutting like a knife. "Ethan, tell me the truth. What are you doing? Do you really think this is right?" Ethan took a step forward, his stance firm, his eyes unwavering. "I don't need you to understand, Mark. This isn't your concern." Mark's expression hardened, his disappointment evident. "You're wrong, Ethan. This isn't just about you. It's about this family, and I can't stand by and do nothing." The room fell deathly quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the wall clock. Vivian felt as though she were trapped between two forces pulling her in opposite directions. But deep down, she knew that this moment was a turning point, one she couldn't avoid any longer. Mark let out a weary sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly as he turned toward the door. Without another word, he left, the sound of the door closing echoing through the house with a cold finality. As the silence settled once more, Vivian turned to Ethan, her eyes brimming with tears. "We can't go on like this, Ethan," she said softly, her voice breaking. "This has to end, before it destroys us both." Ethan didn't respond. He stood motionless, his face etched with pain and frustration. Vivian could see the anguish in his eyes, and it tore at her heart. But she knew that no matter how much she wanted to hold on, she couldn't. Her mind was made up. Vivian reached out, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. I love you, Ethan. But we can't live in the shadows forever. It's time to let go. Ethan remained silent, his expression unreadable as he watched her. And in that stillness, Vivian realized that letting go would be the hardest thing she had ever done. But it was the only way forward, for both of them.